So I'm going to be asking people to provide us some information as we go through the talk, and I'm going to ask you to monitor the questions box because I don't see it, and I'm not
Okay,
going to.
yeah, no problem at all.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, so that's fine. We can do that.
Okay, great. So why don't we get rolling here? And so what I would like those of you in the audience who are willing to share with us to write into the questions box, and then Larry will read those. What you think is the most important part of test automation, and annotate how well you are doing it from 0 for terrible through 5 for great. And then also, if you've got any issues or objectives for today, please also put them into the questions box. So what you think is the most important part of test automation, how well you're doing it, 0 through 5, and your issues and objectives for today. I'm going to continue on because I know it takes people a while to put stuff in, type stuff in. So let me share with you what I see as the objectives for today. Let's see if these are understandable, if they seem reasonable, and if they fit with your own. So first of all, we want to talk about what makes a test valuable and examine the value that automating a test provides and doesn't provide, and why developers and also testers tend to miss important test conditions, and how what I call proactive testing overcomes traditional reactive testing limitations. And so Paul's been talking about low code. I'm just going to talk more generally about low overhead ways to more thoroughly identify and test the highest risks. So Larry, have we gotten any responses?
Yes, I have one. I have one from Jen Bauer, if I pronounce that name correctly. And she's saying that she thinks testing for scenarios that matters is the most important. But at the same time, identifying the scenarios worth testing and the ones that are not worth testing, is what she is more interested in learning more about. And she put
Great,
herself at about a 4.
great, great. So identifying the test scenarios. Okay, very good. So let me continue on. If your experience in testing is like my experience in testing, the biggest challenge that all testers have is that we seem to get no respect. And many of you may be familiar with Rodney Dangerfield, the comedian who died a few years ago, and his catch line was, "I get no respect." And that's really our challenge. And so question is, why do we get no respect, or what do we have to do to get more respect? And there are a lot of people, certainly including a lot of vendors, but also conferences and online presentations that declare that the solution for getting more respect is getting better at test automation. And I'm going to adjust that because I don't think that's really the solution. I think the solution, and Jen, I'm right in line with what you said, getting better at testing is the important part for getting respect. Automation is secondary. So what does make a test valuable? Once again, if you would, please put into the questions box what you feel makes a test valuable. I'm going to continue on the merry way here and suggest that what makes a test valuable is that the test gives confidence that whatever you're testing works. and works properly. And so Paul has just demonstrated some elements of demonstrating that something works. Okay. Now, automating a test, well, it can facilitate repeating the test. Typically, it can execute that test faster than if you have to sit there and key stuff in. Theoretically, it reduces human errors, although Paul was very gracious in making a bunch of examples of how humans can make errors when they're automating the test. And if they don't catch those errors, the test may not catch, the automation may not catch them either. But certainly, one of the big benefits of automating is that you get lower and lower costs of repeating the execution of a test. Okay? Lower cost in terms of time and money. But there are some other considerations related to automating tests. And the first and biggest one is that test automation will not tell us what to test or how to test it well. May give us some guidance on some ways to test it. And by the way, I'm sure none of you have heard the buzzwords machine learning and artificial intelligence. Let me just caution you that machine learning and artificial intelligence may give the appearance of telling you what to test and how to test it well. But I would be very cautious about over-relying on that. Now, here's the other issue, that very often automating a test actually diverts attention to thorough testing, more thorough content attention. And basically what happens is that testing falls down because we miss important test conditions. And when I say we, I'm including both testing specialists and also developers and also users and anybody else who gets involved. And that the biggest weakness of our tests is that they miss stuff. And one of the main reasons when we're dealing with test automation is that we get into focusing on the automation itself and lose sight of the testing. And I'll tell you a little secret here, and I've been a developer for many years. Every developer that I know assumes that things work properly because they wrote it. And somehow or another, as testers, we know that that ain't always so. Now, testers are also poor at identifying test conditions, in part because what they are often doing is reacting to what's in the design or simply in the code. Okay. So if all you are doing is executing the code as it's written, what are you missing? Anything that's not in the code that ought to be there, anything that's in the code that's incorrect. Okay. And by and large, the errors are in the design. So coding, when we look at where errors come from in the overall development process, coding is actually the smallest source of errors. And focusing on coding tends to divert attention from design, system design and module design. Okay? And what we find is about 2/3 of errors in delivered code are errors that are in the design. So if you're only looking at what's been built, you have very little chance of detecting what should have been built, where the design was deficient. And there's something much more onerous that far fewer people recognize. And that is that the biggest source of errors is errors in defining or discovering business requirements. Because most system design errors are simply reflecting an inadequate, inappropriate understanding of the business requirements. So when we look at the types of tests that get automated, almost all of them are focusing on coding issues. Okay? I think Paul would agree with me that the tests that he was just creating, albeit low code, were still focused on coding errors that a developer might have made. Okay? Not on design errors and very much not on business requirements errors. So I have this technique or methodology that I call proactive testing. And one of the strengths of proactive testing in comparison to traditional reactive testing is that proactive testing is concerned with whether the requirements are right, whether the design is right, as well as whether the code is right. Okay? And requirements and design errors, those are the most important things to detect. And those are the things that the testing pyramid and traditional emphases upon low-level coding tests simply will not catch. Now, just to elaborate, I'm sure many people use the term requirements in a variety of ways. I use two types of requirements. To my thinking, there are only two types of requirements that are important. On the left, what I call real business or user or customer or stakeholder requirements. These are from the perspective of and in the language of the business, the user, the stakeholder, the customer. I just refer to them in general as business, real business requirements. They are conceptual and they exist within the business environment. And because they exist, they need to be discovered. Real business requirements on the left are business deliverable whats that when delivered or satisfied or met, provide value. And they provide value by serving business objectives, solving business needs, solving problems, taking opportunities, meeting challenges. Now, I would guess that that's very similar to what a lot of you mean by requirements, and realize that there are usually many possible ways to accomplish the real business requirements on the left. Product, system, software requirements, and I use those terms interchangeably, are a human-defined, or they from the view of a human-defined product, system, or software. And they're in the language of that human-defined product, system, or software. And remember that that human-defined product, system, or software represents one of these many possible ways how to presumably accomplish the presumed real business requirements on the left. And perhaps you noticed that I emphasized the word presumed, because product requirements on the right typically are based on a lot of presumptions. And presumptions have a way of being wrong. And the more that we presume, the more wrong those product requirements are likely to be. By the way, product requirements are often referred to as functional specifications. And then going along with that are non-functional requirements or specifications. Now, common conventional wisdom is that creep occurs because requirements, meaning the product requirements on the right, are not sufficiently clear or testable. And if you're in the testing world, you know that testing tends to emphasize testability as what it considers to be the big issue with requirements. In general, a requirement is not testable ordinarily because it is not clear. And so the conventional wisdom is that requirements, meaning product requirements on the right, creep because they are not sufficiently clear or testable. Well, I'm going to suggest to you that while clarity and testability are certainly important, that product requirements on the right generally creep because they fail to satisfy the real business requirements on the left. And the primary reason why the product requirements on the right fail to satisfy the real business requirements on the left is because the real business requirements on the left have not been defined adequately. The primary reason why the real business requirements on the left are not defined adequately is because the conventional wisdom is that the product requirements on the right are, quote unquote, the requirements. So I'm sure many of you are familiar with the term-based testing. A lot of people overuse that term and misunderstand it. But basically, a common approach is that the testers are given something to test, and the testers start by creating test cases, executable inputs and/or conditions, and expected results. And then they analyze and prioritize the risks that those test cases address, and they run the ones with the higher risks first, earlier, more. So let's look at an example. Let's say that you've created 100 test cases. You have time to run only 10 of them. So what are you going to do? You're going to prioritize them and run the top 10. So the first question is, what value did you get from the time that you spent creating the 90 tests that you don't run? I think that's a pretty simple answer. Not much. And what about all the test cases that you didn't think of at all? And in fact, how confident are you that the 100 test cases that you did identify, in fact, were testing the most important things? And in fact, are you testing real business requirements or product requirements? And if you're simply reacting to the product, which is what most testing does, you're going to miss a large portion of the design errors, which in turn are due to inadequate definition of real business requirements. So what's test automation likely to do with regard to that risk analysis? Well, even in the low code example, automating a test, but especially in more traditional test automation, automating a test typically takes anywhere from 3 to 20 times as long as running that test manually. So what do people largely automate? The first tests they think of, and then they execute until they're out of time. And where did the risk analysis go? Well, it was at best way, way, way in your subconscious as you were identifying tests that came to your mind first. Okay? And so there's a very good chance that the automating actually diverts us from meaningful risk analysis. So I suggested that proactive testing, my methodology, is an alternative that helps us get the right tests or get better tests right. So, first of all, proactive testing is an iterative practice. Whatever size piece of code is being coded should be designed and responsive to adequately defined real business requirements, and they should all be relevantly tested. In other words, the requirement needs to be confirmed that it's right, the design needs to be confirmed that it's right, and then the code needs to be tested to demonstrate that it carries out the design and satisfies the real business requirement. So proactive testing has a number of special techniques that enable the discovery and specification of the system, of the project, the code, to be more complete, more accurate, clearer, and more testable. In other words, ways to catch problems in the requirements and design when they're easier and cheaper to fix than waiting for them to be coded wrong and then hope that our very expensive and time-consuming dynamic tests, whether or not automated, in fact detect those. So proactive testing has more than 21 ways to review requirements adequacy. Typical organizations use 0, 1, or 2 techniques, usually techniques that are far weaker than they realize. Similarly, we have more than 15 ways to review designs. Most folks use 1 or 2 or no techniques to review designs. And then proactive testing gives us guidance on planning and designing dynamic tests. First, by revealing requirements and design issues, and then by defining more complete tests, both technical or development tests, and also proactive user acceptance tests. And we do that early before the code is written so that we're catching and preventing errors rather than letting the errors develop and then hope we can catch them and fix them when they're much harder to test. Proactive testing is a low overhead technique. And a key concept of proactive testing is that we let testing drive development. Now, this is not a political concept. This is a knowledge concept. And that is by using proactive testing techniques that help us identify issues in the requirements and design, that enables the developers to build better stuff in the first place. And it also enables us to develop tests much quicker and easier and cheaper that help us confirm that we, in fact, have economically anticipated and averted the big consequences of design issues that ordinarily cause so much of our rework. And because we're doing this early, often before the code is written, what we're doing is giving us ways to prioritize so that we can avoid the biggest rework risks. By implementing those biggest risks initially, catching issues with them and fixing them before they become more expensive and more difficult to deal with. Proactive testing helps us become aware of many commonly overlooked conditions that both the code and the tests of the code often miss. So we're planning and designing our tests early. We're prioritizing and developing them using methods, special methods that promote reuse, reuse of test assets, not just test cases, but test designs as well. And we're detecting issues, big issues, and then medium-sized issues, and then smaller issues. And we're using approaches like reusable test designs and reusable test cases that can further increase the efficiency of executing tests. And all of this is implemented selectively based upon risk, where our guideline is that we want to write just enough to be helpful, no more, but no less. So I've talked about proactive testing. Let me give you a simple example. This is a real example that came up in a testing class that I presented a couple of years ago. And so in the class, we have the participants provide a case, and then we practice the proactive testing risk analysis with the participants in the class. So this particular case came from a participant who worked for an auto insurance company. And this person described the system as for use by independent insurance agents. And that the first thing that the system does was ascertain who the client is, the types of cars and drivers and records, and information about them and their car, and things like what kind of coverage you want, how much deductibles, basic stuff that you would expect to find in an auto insurance application. And that if the person applying for insurance, if their information passes initial scrutiny, then some additional questions are asked about liens on the vehicle. That is whether the vehicle is owned, under a leasing arrangement, or if there's a mortgage or installment payments are being made on the vehicle, who else might be insured, how they want to be billed, how they want to pay. And then the system, based on that information, calculates the premium, provides it to the applicant, and the applicant on a form that the applicant can then print out, sign, and return with payment to the independent agent. So pretty straightforward. I'm sure that many of you have used an application like this. Some of you may, in fact, work on them daily. So if you were going to automate the testing of this, it's probably pretty straightforward. If you feel like it, please put into the questions box, how would you go about automating this? What would you automate first? While you are doing that, let me share with you what the participants in the class came up with. So the first thing was that we had the author of the case identify what I believe it was a he in this instance, what the author said would be the big risks that testing should address. And so the author said, well, if we got one car and one driver, that's the basic. If we have more cars than drivers, more drivers than cars, additional drivers, the age groups that people are in, because age groups, at least in the US, that's an important factor in setting rates, and their accident and ticket history, whether they've been caught speeding, for instance. Okay. So there's a good chance that some of these might correspond to some of the things that you've identified. But we didn't stop there. Before we left the author, we gave the author a little bit more encouragement. Said, well, come on, what else? Think a little bit more. Oh, and the author said, oh, well, yeah, we really ought to, at this point, get a copy of the motor vehicle record from the motor vehicle agency. And, oh, we have to know what the rates are. So we got to be sure that they're there. We've got to make sure that agents can use this. And then this front end has to flow to the in-house system in the back end. Now, I think that each of these is pretty important. And what's the significance of just identifying these additional conditions in red compared to not identifying them? Darn, I think you can see right off the bat that simply exercising a little bit more discipline, not much, can dramatically increase our identification of important tests. Then we opened the discussion to the other participants in the class. And the additional ideas were data validation and editing. What about, online connections and session continuity? Okay, what about capacity and performance? What about compatibility? Compatibility with hardware and software environments and checking for viruses. So all of a sudden, what have we done? Darn, these seem not so bad. These seem a lot better, and these are better still. Okay? And we're not talking about rocket science here. We're not even talking about the complexities of writing low-code tests. Okay? We're talking about applying the human brain, which too often gets left out of development and testing. So all of a sudden, we have way more than doubled the conditions. These are big conditions because if any of these goes wrong, it's almost certainly going to be a showstopper. And then we went further with some additional, more detailed test planning and design techniques and had some guidelines to help prompt people's thinking. And so all of a sudden, people said, oh, yeah, what about printing the quotes in the application forms? Does that really work? Are we following underwriting rules? What about the process for getting that printed application and the payment? Okay, so what if somebody generates the form but then doesn't actually file it? Shouldn't we have some way to follow up because that's a live prospect? There's all kinds of minimums of set of data that we need to be concerned with. The calculations need to be tested, the security and firewalls and antivirus. Okay, we sort of mentioned that earlier, but there's more to it, obviously. Okay. Oh, now, if you're familiar with people who apply for loans, which is what's typically happening here, or may be related to the applying for the insurance, the person's credit score may be a factor in how we rate them, okay? Calculate their premiums. Okay? What if they want to pay with a credit card? What if the credit card is not approved? What if the credit card approval third-party system is somehow not accessible? Okay. Does it matter if this is a new customer or an existing customer? Yeah. This system is undoubtedly affecting multiple database records. By the way, in my experience, one of the areas where testers tend to be very weak is with regard to database testing. Okay? Tends not to be their area of strength. They often don't have the skills and knowledge or access to the tools. Databases are increasingly the place where errors manifest themselves. Okay. Do we have any limit on how many requests for quotes we can handle? Should we be reporting back to anybody on the various types of quotes? How many quotes actually don't end up in purchases and how many do? What if we're getting multiple quotes for the same person? Why would that happen? Okay. Is that indicative of anything else? Okay. Should we be able to compare doing this insurance application over the web to the more traditional processes of applying by phone or mail or even in person? Getting back to the database, do we ever have to purge and conversely archive records? And what about these other systems that it has to interact with? There's a lot of downstream systems, back-end systems that it has to interact with. We better make sure that those interactions are occurring. So all of a sudden, what's the difference between identifying all of these conditions versus just the ones that came to the top of the author's consciousness? What's this have to do with automation? Well, if you know that these are all risks, now you've got a much richer environment to decide which tests to automate, which tests to run first, which tests to run later. If the automation reveals one thing or another, what else might you automate, and so forth. Without having all of these variables to consider or risks to consider, you're simply going to automate whatever came to mind. And there's a good chance you're going to miss all of these other things. How many would ordinarily be automated? Slim to none. Okay? Are those things that the developers would even think to code, let alone unit test? I think not. Okay? And even user story acceptance tests, I think would miss a very large portion of those. And by and large, if they go wrong in the delivered system, how many of them would be showstoppers? And how much redesign and rework would they necessitate? So, can you see how a low overhead approach, such as my proactive testing, to identify the biggest risks that testing can and should address, really positions you to make your automation much more effective, much more useful. And by the way, identifying these risks up front before the system is coded dramatically reduces the likelihood that those risks will occur. So let's see if we've done what we set out to do. What makes a test valuable? It gives us confidence that something works. The value that automating a test provides is ultimately it aids repetition and reduces repeated costs of repeated execution. What it doesn't provide is identifying what we must demonstrate to be confident it works. Developers and testers tend to miss important test conditions because they jump right into code and react to the code that's written, and they overlook the major source of defects, which is design. And the major source of design errors is errors of real business requirements. Proactive testing gives us a way to address all of those and to do it earlier and much more effectively, so that it can not only catch more errors, it can prevent them or help prevent them. Okay. And I think you can sense that proactive testing is really a low overhead technique that helps us more thoroughly identify and test the highest risks. So this is a diagram of some of the courses and consulting that I do. Okay. And many of these are available on demand at softwareexcellenceacademy.com. Okay. If you're interested in working directly with me, I'd be glad to work with you to present one or more of these or related courses at your site and convenience, to work with you in a consulting and advisory capacity and mentoring, working on your test identification and test process and project management. And if you want to reach me, Robin at gopromanagement.com. I'll tell you right off the bat that my website hasn't been updated for years. That may change in the near future. I'm hoping that it does. If you're interested in requirements, I have a book called Discovering Real Business Requirements for Software Project Success, and a book that's been in the works for a while called Cut Creep. And it's about writing right, agile user stories and their acceptance tests. So, Larry, do we have any questions here?
Yeah, sure. Going back a little bit to where you was talking about risk of the systems, and one of the questions was, seeing that everything that you're talking about, it was all what we call the happy path. You know, what is the process in place for when the system it fail gracefully as opposed to it crashing?
Okay. So I think that there were at least 2 points in there that I want to respond to. The first one is that proactive testing absolutely is concerned not just with the happy path, but with the alternatives and exceptions. And that when we proactively test all of those various conditions, it's not just the happy path, it's what can go wrong, what else needs to happen, what can go wrong, what's related to it, and so forth. Now, the second thing that you mentioned was soft land versus a crash. The fact is that how it responds to problems should be part of the system's design. It seldom is. And too many people rely on the system blowing up to give them an indication that there's an error. And because of that, they often miss all kinds of other defects simply because they didn't cause the system to blow up. Proactive testing says, first of all, if you want soft landings, you need to design the system to land softly, and you need to test that that design, in fact, works as intended. And that crashing versus soft landing is not something that you should rely on chance for. So I hope that gets to the question. If not, please expand or clarify.
I think that that answers it well. Yeah, I think that was the only question that coming in from the thing. But I have a question. I mean, I I listened to it and you went through it and you made an interesting point about databases and not much people look into or take the care where that is concerned. You want to elaborate a little more on that whole database people not caring because we know it happens.
Okay, so I wasn't sure whether you had a question there.
Yeah, okay, let me go back. I'm not sure if you hear me properly, but the question is, when I was talking about all the systems and a lot of things take place in the databases, we find of late we don't have much testing around databases, I'm just talking, we don't have much of it. We have they build a database and they work, they run a few queries, and it's fine. I mean, you know, how could we, delve more into the database side of it?
So I agree completely that in my experience, there are several areas where testers tend to be especially weak. One of them is with regard to testing databases. And I don't know about your experience, but in my experience, an awful lot of the system's functionality is implemented in the database with regard to how the database records are structured and relate to each other and so forth. And I have found very few testers who even attempt to test database content and structure. And those who do very seldom have the sophisticated skills and tools necessary to dig deep into the database. So most database testing I've seen is done through the GUI, and the testing that you're able to do of a database through the GUI often will not be adequate to reveal internal issues within the database. You really need to be able to get looking physically at the database and at its indexes and so forth. Let me share with you, excuse me, let me share with you an experience that I had a couple of years ago. I was asked by a company whose services you were probably familiar with. You may not know the company name, but they asked me to come in and work with their testers and give them independent evaluation of their testing process. And what I found was that this organization, this company, had a very large and very complex database. And their developers would write select statements that literally filled a page, 30, 40, 50 lines to a select statement, because there were all kinds of joins and internal if statements and so forth. And the testers had a separate, they were using SQL. The testers had a separate tool that they could use to generate SQL queries. But the SQL queries that they generated were simply based upon replicating the database logic that the developer said he or she had used in writing the code. So the independent test of the database did nothing more than confirm what the developers said they were doing. In other words, they were not doing what testing should be doing, which is providing an independent view to confirm what the developer said or to reveal differences. And they were incredibly at risk because they very likely had all kinds of logic and database errors that were simply never going to be discovered this way. So does that get to your question, Larry?
Yeah, that answers it perfectly. And I mean, I have no more questions up on the board for you. So at this point, so thanks. It was very interesting and informative from your part, and I hope our wider community, take away some things, take away from some things from it, from yourself, and take away something from it as well. So thank you very much for sharing out your time. And in saying that, I also want to thank Paul as well, Paul Grossman. Yeah, I want to thank him as well for his insight into this whole low code testing tools that we have out there. I know we ran out of time with him. I have a question for him that I'll ask him when I see him next time. So thank you very much. And on that note, I also want to thank Ziplatech for giving us this opportunity to to talk and pass on our experiences to the people out there, and also for everyone that's looking and watching, took time out to look and watch and listen. I want to say, thank you very much for the time, and hopefully, if you have questions outside of where we are now, you could ask them. You all have access to our contact details, so you can reach out and ask questions, and I'm sure both Paul and Robin would be too glad to help. So thanks again, and I think so thank you again for everybody, and on behalf of Zaplatech, thank you for the time.